Good afternoon, everyone. So yesterday we started with some simple examples, then went into theory, and now we turn to policy. The model that we discussed yesterday had no public sector, but it is, of course, very easy to add a public sector to a general equilibrium model. And I don't need to expand on this. Public goods, education, social security, tax, etc. are public activities. And these activities are carried out at certain levels or with some parameters, which entail a global budget which may be in deficit or surplus depending upon the circumstances and the parameters. Examples of policy parameters: the salaries of public servants, fixed amount allocated to defense, media, police, and so on, tuition fees and school budgets or any other kind of tariff for public goods with exclusion, pensions, unemployment benefits, tax rates, etc. Now, the budget balance under given values for all these parameters will vary with the variations in overall activity that we saw yesterday could be expected. In that case, there may be need to adjust, perhaps temporarily, the policy parameters. This would be the case if there is a deficit which is expected to last for a while if the parameters are not adjusted. Now, these adjustments could, of course, best be part of a known long-run program so that they would not surprise the agents. If the agents are aware of the fact that we are in a recession today, they should not be surprised if one mentions adjustments of policy parameters. And the long-run program would also spare us the need to reach political agreement. It would be pre-agreed and not subject of political competition. Now, insofar as I know, such programs pre-announcing the adjustments to economic activity levels do not exist anywhere. Anyone knows a country or organization where these programs are conceived in advance? And you know one, Sergio? No, you don't. In fact, programs for adjusting parameters to circumstances may be considered at 4 levels. And let me take 4 levels: the basement, the ground floor, the upper floor, and the roof terrace. 4 levels. In the basement, there is no light, it is dark, and there are many economists and policy makers who do not raise the question, should we have a plan to cope with, say, recessions? Ignored. We are on the ground floor and we are discussing this issue. But of course, in very general terms, we are not proposing explicitly such a program. For that, one should continue the work, go up to the upper floor to be free from the noise of the street and work seriously. And if we succeed, we will end up with a program that can be implemented automatically. If a recession reaches a certain degree, we know what policy adjustments and parameter adjustments the program recommends, and it is implemented automatically, and we may sit in the sun and relax and forget about it. Now, we are very far from that today, of course, and I would like today to evoke in very general terms two issues. The first one review public policies that may contribute to reduce the capital gap while controlling inflation and sustaining expectations, what Theorem 7.1 calls for. And then discuss the definition of policies responding to imperfectly foreseen variations. So there is here a dimension of efficiency as well as the dimension of coping with deficits. To begin with the issue of reducing the capital gap, I have for a long time been convinced that the privileged instrument should be public investments, meaning either investment by the public sector or investment stimulated by the public sector through specific measures inspired by the circumstances. The important aspect of investment is that if the investment is economically sound, so that the future benefits cover fully ex ante the current cost, they have no adverse intergenerational aspects. The next generation will inherit the investment and enjoy the benefits, and it will have to handle the debt that was incurred. Even if it is a foreign debt, it is not a losing proposition for the future generations. And I'll come back in a minute to how the Maastricht Treaty fails in that respect. I listed for your benefit 3 earlier occasions when I came up already with this suggestion. 1987, 30 years ago, 93, 2013, no time to go into the details, but these were mostly recommendations made by groups of economists, not just by Jacques DREZE, as you can see. No, here. Yes. The last time, 2013, was just with one colleague, but with many contacts. The Juncker plan for investment today is at long last adopting the view that we should promote investment to deal with the recession. And even more recently, our Prime Minister, Charles Michel, brought in a proposal of Belgian investments as part of means to cope with the recession. Note, however, that the national level is not natural when the objective is to stimulate aggregate demand. European countries, to illustrate, but Belgium in particular, is too small and too open to capture the benefits of policies aimed at stimulating aggregate demand. It takes either very large countries like the US, Russia, or China, or communities like the EMU. It takes this size for demand stimulation programs to make sense. In Europe, I regard EMU as the natural level. I think the EU itself, with 27, not 28 anymore, 27 or 28 members, is too much diversity, and it would be very difficult to promote demand stimulation program. But at the EMU level, it is much more natural, and the single currency adds, of course, to the incentives to do so. But currently, the EMU is a purely financial organization, and it would take statutory reforms, structural reforms, to enable it to engage in demand stimulation programs. So I think we should prepare for that, even if we don't expect that it will be put into practice, and we should define precisely what reforms are needed. So much for aggregate demand. If we turn to inflation, I was taught by William Vickrey when I was a student at Columbia that inflation itself is not important if it is precisely foreseen, but inflation uncertainty is harmful because it adds to the uncertainties that individuals have to cope with. So I think we know reasonably well how to avoid inflation uncertainty, announce a clear goal, and that is what the European Central Bank does, 2%, not more. Rely on open market operations to keep the inflation rate in that range. That is the policy adopted by the Federal Reserve in the US. It is occasionally adopted by the ECB, but less clearly, and I think it is the natural tool to use. And then when you are faced with accidents, excessive inflation at some point, we learned after the first oil shock in the late 70s and 80s that credit restrictions were very effective in curtailing inflation. So I'll leave it at that. But the more difficult issue concerns the budget deficits. There are two ways to handle these. I have referred in the past few minutes to adjustments of policies and policy parameters. The alternative, of course, is borrowing, all the way from borrowing from the central bank to issuing bonds in the local currency to possibly issuing bonds in foreign currencies. Now, when is it appropriate to rely on borrowing? When should one go to policy and parameter adjustments? Well, the well-known consideration, of course, is that borrowing affects the intergenerational redistribution. This is perfectly clear in case of foreign borrowing. You let the following generations deal with the debt. And if instead you have recourse to policy parameter adjustments, that need not be intergenerationally biased. So there is much more to be said about both the budgetary implications and the intergenerational implications of adjustments to policy parameters, and that should be on the research agenda. Regarding the intergenerational implications of public debt, there is an ample literature, Ricardian equivalence, whatnot, and closer to home, there is the Maastricht Treaty, which imposed a ceiling of 60% on the ratio of public debt to GDP in all member countries, and also imposes a ceiling of 3% on the budget deficit as percentage of GDP, these two numbers being implicitly related. I have from the beginning been very unhappy about the 60% debt ceiling of the Maastricht Treaty. First, because there is no distinction there between borrowing to finance investments and borrowing to finance consumption. And I think the distinction should be made, and public investments could be debt financed without violating a EU decision. But there is another issue which puzzles me to some extent. What is the leading element of the public debt of our countries today? It is unfunded pension rights. And unfunded pension rights in most European countries amount to 2 or 3 times GDP, much more than the 60% concerned in Maastricht. In Maastricht, in fact, there is some funding of pensions. The ratio of unfunded rights to GDP is probably less than 2. But in countries like the UK, it is 4. Amazing. Now, should we take into account these unfunded pension rights when we reflect on intergenerational redistribution? I write there, no, you don't see it, yes. I write there, if pensions were adjusted to circumstances, they would not to that extent entail intergenerational redistribution, but globally the issue is, in my mind, open how they should come into our evaluation of intergenerational equity, and whether they might dominate the public debt element, which is much less quantitatively. It is of some interest to understand how the Maastricht 60% came up. If you start with an aggregate gross productivity of 2% per year, which is a frequently used figure, and if you have an inflation expectation of 2%, then the natural growth of nominal GDP will be 4%. Real will be 2%, nominal will be 4%. Now, if you had public bonds with an interest rate of 4%, a real rate of 2%, then a 100% debt GDP ratio would entail a constant that with 100% debt GDP ratio, the burden of 4% would be equal to the growth rate of GDP, and so the ratio would be constant, and you would find that a natural definition of intergenerational neutrality. No intergenerational redistribution through the public debt. Now, why is the Maastricht level much lower? There is, of course, an argument of uncertainty and safety margin. It is nice to say we expect 4% nominal growth, but then there are accidents. And in such cases, the 100% debt GDP ratio cannot be maintained without entailing some intergenerational redistribution. This being said, I would present as follows the issue of choosing the adjustment. First, appraise whether the current debt level is compatible with intergenerational equity. And if there is room there, you may debt finance. If there is no room, you may not. You should appreciate that looking at the size of the deficit and its expected duration. If it is a small deficit that is not expected to last, you can rely on debt without killing the margin that may exist. But if that is not the case, then you have to go into parameter adjustments, and that, of course, I will discuss at some length. Indeed, if you are in a situation like that of Belgium today, where the financing of deficits through debt is regarded as a break of EU agreements, you have to make some adjustments, and what principles should guide these? We heard this morning that the federal government of Belgium is looking for 4.2 billion euros by 2018, and is ruling out, the current government is ruling out a number of fairly natural and certainly easy to implement adjustments. For instance, raising the basic VAT rate from 21 to 22% is apparently ruled out by the current government. So they are in the basement discussing what adjustments should be made. If one asks oneself what principles should guide adjustments, I think it's in fact a totally relevant, immediate question today. What should we suggest to the federal government to raise this 4.2 billion? Now, at the level of abstraction and generality with which we discuss this on the ground floor, I think one would naturally go back to Borch's theorem and to the mutuality and sensitivity principles. The mutuality principle says the adjustments should have widespread effects, hopefully involving all the incomes and resources of all the citizens. But the sensitivity principle adds immediately, but those citizens better able to bear a contribution, to make a contribution, should be the most deeply involved. Now, I shall not develop any suggestions specific for what adjustments should receive particular attention in general and what adjustments should be mentioned to the federal government. But I think that there should be more work on these topics, starting with the mutuality and sensitivity principle of Borch's theorem. I also note quickly that if we had through creativity found a way to include capital gains in the income tax, then of course the taxable income would come close to representing the whole national income and would be very natural candidates for policy adjustments. And I said before that if we ever move up to the roof terrace and have a program defined in advance that permit automatic adjustments, then of course we would basically have solved this problem. There are examples easily put forward, for instance, linking pensions to GDP per capita. I mentioned that because I would be immediately affected, and I can confirm that I would find that natural and would definitely not object and would prefer that to seeing the government continue to look around without knowing exactly what it will be doing. There is a global interesting topic of how different economic parameters might advantageously be linked to specific macro variables. You note that I write here linking pensions to GDP per capita. Now GDP per capita is a specific concept. It is not exactly the same as global GDP, and it is certainly not the same as global wealth, etc. So I think there is here a research challenge to investigate how one could work with automatic adjustments of policy parameters. I will add one suggestion that I find important. When one discusses the measures that should be taken to cope with the recession, everybody agrees that the richest should be taxed more than they are today. And the only question is, how can one do that efficiently? There are, of course, some discussions about international fiscal competition that come into the debate. But there is another equally convincing statement to be made, namely that the least favored members of society should not be affected, and even more, those who are destitute because of the recession should receive primary attention and should not contribute indirectly to restoring budget balance. One should be willing to devote resources to assist them. And there is one group that stands out there, young, unskilled workers looking for a first job. The first impact of a recession is that new hirings are affected negatively. So that young people looking for their first job have less chance of success than before. I'm surprised that this does not come out more clearly in the data. If you look at the ratio of employment among the young to unemployment among the young, to unemployment in the aggregate. So you have a rate For the young, you have a rate for the average, and what is the ratio of the two? The ratio is of the order of 2 and more. You have here the last 12 years, and you have a number of countries, and over this table, 2 stands out as the most frequent number. One line concerning Germany stands out with definitely lower figures throughout, and this is the ratio. It is not saying that unemployment in Germany is less than elsewhere. It is saying that it does not penalize the young as much as elsewhere. And we know, of course, that the German programs of joint training in schools and firms is very powerful instruments to bring young people into the labor force. For all I know, it is a complex program involving collaboration of the firms, the unions, the schools, the public authorities, and it is implemented in part through the presence of union representatives on boards of directors and the issuance of certificates of training in the firms, etc. But none of that, for all I know, would be impossible to reproduce in other countries. So I think there is more to be done on that. You wanted to ask a question, Pierre? But if you do, you need the microphone.
Which I think it would be useful to include Switzerland in your figures. I would expect the figures to be quite like the one in Germany.
Thank you for the remark. The reason why Switzerland is not on the list is that these are all EU and even almost all EMU countries. I'll check the okay. Summing up before turning to the international dimension. Summing up, I have advocated here to rely on public investment or properly subsidized private investment, but in both cases such that the future public returns cover the current cost. I've advocated that to boost demand and possibly debt financed. Mentioned open market transactions as the natural inflation instrument, and recognize that selective temporary adjustments of public policy parameters should be brought in to cope with budget deficits, hoping that one might prepare a plan deciding or formulating in advance how the policy parameters should be adjusted to the circumstances. And then I have insisted not to forget the young unskilled. I think this also leads to the formulation of research challenges, which are just repeating what the issues are. All right, so I turn to the international dimension. And remind you that in an international environment, Borch's theorem invites the mutualization of idiosyncratic country risks, and with the two-stage application of Borch that I mentioned yesterday, that will be complemented by domestic measures, but the international mutualization should take the form of transfers across country. There is the issue of how the sensitivity principle will come in if we talk about countries as the intervenants in the mutualization. I'll come back to that in a minute. So I again refer to EMU as a natural example. Repeat for the third or fourth time this afternoon that EMU is a purely financial organization with no budget of its own. So many people have come to realize that idiosyncratic risks within EMU are important. The whole debate on what to do about Greece and Portugal and Ireland and so on is recognition that there are idiosyncratic risks. And people who are eager to cope with such risks and cope with them in the future as well as in the present refer to international fiscal integration. Indeed, if there was, say, a EMU-level income tax system, this would entail a form of redistribution. If in a country like Greece incomes fall, the income tax receipts will fall, and that will affect an EMU budget and not a Greek budget. Now, this is, of course, a very big step. And we know, for instance, in Belgium, that fiscal integration is not easy to accept by everybody. Many people label interregional transfers what are in fact transfers between income classes. If you have more rich people in one region than the next, automatically there will be more fiscal receipts, and the fiscal receipts will not be equated per capita. And there is no question that some form of fiscal integration of other measures, perhaps even labor tax and social security contributions, would be helpful both to mutualize risks between countries and to avoid fiscal competition between the countries. But this is quite demanding, and in the meantime, I wish to mention an alternative which I have developed with my friend Alain Duret in a recent paper, 2014, which I will very briefly describe. It says, let each country issue bonds indexed on its GDP. That is a bond promising to pay 1% of the Greek GDP or the German GDP or whatever at a certain time, and you exchange these for bonds indexed on the aggregate EMU GDP for that year. Now, the EMU authorities collect the bonds from the different countries. That gives them bonds indexed on the EMU GDP simply by putting them together. So the authorities will issue bonds indexed on the aggregate EMU GDP for year T and distribute these in exchange for the bonds indexed on national GDPs. So this means that if the GDP of one country like Greece is below expectations, part of that is at the charge of EMU and not of Greece, which part, the part corresponding to what percentage of GDP were the bonds issued for. And that is one must agree at the start for what percentage of GDP shall we mutualize risk through bond exchanges. The only difficulty with that scheme is to decide how many EMU bonds to give to each country in exchange for their bonds. These are bonds for year T, and in order for this scheme to be effective, they must be bonds of the order of 10, 12, perhaps 30 years. If there were one-year bonds, one would use today's GDP as the basis for deciding how many EMU bonds to give to Greece in exchange for its national bonds. But if we talk about 12 or 15 years hence, there is a question of predicting the evolution of the Greek GDP. And I don't know of a definitive answer to that question. One possibility would be to organize a market for bonds indexed on GDP for year T and let the market prices decide. One would exchange bonds of equal market value. But do we trust markets to generate appropriate forecasts? It is, I think, an open question. I have in the past done some ex post simulations where the data were available, but there are not many data on bonds indexed on a country's GDP. Now, one interesting remark is that when the EMU collects the bonds and decides on the rates of exchange between a country bond and an EMU bond, it is possible to make the exchange rate depend on policy decisions in the relevant countries. If the EMU thinks that Belgium must by all means balance its federal budget by 2018, it may accept Belgian bonds in exchange for EMU bonds at a higher rate if Belgium satisfies this condition and at a lower rate if it does not. And there are a number of conceivable policies that would indeed affect the future GDP that the EMU may want to implement but without success so far, and which could be linked to this arrangement. Mind you, this paper with Alain Duret, which contains a specific suggestion for this problem of valuation, has not been accepted for publication in leading European journals and has appeared in Recherche économique de Louvain. I don't have time to detail the suggestion in that paper, but it is based on the observation that in federal nations there are idiosyncratic risks affecting the individual states, but there are trends of convergence of the GDP per capita of the states toward a common measure. And that was the inspiration for our proposal. Now I said if you try to develop a program for policy adjustments in case of public deficits, go back to Borch, try to implement mutualisation and the sensitivity principle. Now we are at the international level, and in order to apply the sensitivity principle, we need to evaluate risk tolerances at the national level. It is not always easy to measure risk tolerance at the individual level, but it is a problem to define them at the country level. I think this can be done because all the risks borne by a country are ultimately borne by the individual citizens, and in the same way that we discussed yesterday how the risk preferences of shareholders should be taken into account by firms, I think a similar analysis would apply and enable us to evaluate risk tolerances for countries and then to take this into account in a more sophisticated version of mutualization through indexed bonds. No, I'm going the wrong way. Yes. more research challenges in this respect. And it is time to conclude. Good news, time to conclude. So I will conclude by summarizing what I have proposed in terms of policies and then in terms of theory. First remark, conclusion does not mean summary. You may introduce new elements. The recession of 2008 was brought about by abuses in the handling of mortgages in the United States. I raised the question, could such abuses have come about in a complete markets economy? And then I must say, I don't know, because we have no experience with complete market economies. But they did occur. They did occur in a framework of incomplete market economies. And of course, there is more room for abuses, misbehavior, deceptive expectations, and whatnot in an incomplete markets economy. So we should not be that surprised that it could happen. And then, of course, in the incomplete markets economy, once the shock is occurred, the consequences will perpetuate themselves without any endogenous corrective mechanism awaiting proper policies. I find it important to stress the fact that policies to cope with such recessions did not exist in 2008. Mind you, they did not exist in 29 either. And the fact that a deep recession like that of 29 had not occurred for 79 years explains, of course, that developing policies to cope with such recessions was not a priority item on our agenda. But I raised the question today, can it happen again? And my answer is unequivocal. Of course it can happen again. And of course, we economists should move from the ground floor to the upper floor and work seriously on developing programs that could facilitate coping with future recessions. Now, these needed policies should stimulate aggregate demand and macroeconomic expectations. New investments remain my first choice. They may be debt finance, but they require international programs. This is summary. And with reference to EMU, I mentioned before that statutory reforms might be needed to make it possible, for instance, for AMU to sponsor community-level investment programs. I mentioned that such statutory reforms would be my preferred reaction to Brexit. My view of the future of Europe is two levels: a European Union with a single market, of course, but limited economic policy ambitions. Inside EMU, accepting responsibility for such things as demand policies and playing a much more important role. And when other countries debate whether they want to remain in Europe or not, if the ambitions of the two levels were clearly defined, the decisions to be made would be clearer. I write there in reference to Brexit, I refer to a slightly trimmed EMU. I mentioned in passing that, to my understanding, a monetary union including Germany and Greece is not a sound, viable proposal. All right. Regarding the temporary adjustment, I referred back to mutualism and sensitivity and insisted on handling the problems of young, unskilled workers out of work. So, as you can see, my policy program is reasonably simple, but fairly comprehensive. And I'm looking forward to the discussion period to see if it receives some support. Now, turning to theory, Theorem 7.1 was the key component of my presentation at the theoretical level, and I labeled it the juncture between micro and macro theory. Of course, it does not exhaust the topic, but to replace the search for micro foundations of macroeconomics by the formulation of a model that captures the main elements of micro-analysis at stake, and then formulate conclusions in terms of macro variables and specifies what are the macro challenges, is of course an intriguing way of introducing theory in our teaching programs. I have mentioned the teaching challenge of experimenting with such an approach, and I hope that this challenge may stimulate someone. But at the same time, we need to look in the dynamics more closely, and fit dynamic stochastic general equilibrium into a picture where the micro part comes from temporary general equilibrium. But there are, of course, many issues that need to be captured by the microanalysis. I have mentioned price rigidities, quantity rationing. I have mentioned the implications of fixed cost, but the theorem itself assumes convex production sets. I have mentioned the extension to several countries. There remains a lot to be done. At a more mundane level, I have invoked mutuality and sensitivity. There remains a lot to be done to master the applications of this principle. In particular, I have repeatedly noted how difficult it was to implement the sensitivity principle, and I have specified the issue with reference to applying mutuality and sensitivity to policy adjustments in presence of budget deficits. I have also, in the first lecture, mentioned the creativity challenge, and I hope that even if it is difficult to conceive where the creativity will express itself, I think the challenge is there. Globally, in the presence of all the difficulties that are raised by uncertainty, difficulties that the market mechanism cannot resolve, I recommend proceeding in steps. And as an example, I have suggested implementing cumulative averaging of today's income taxes, which should start by simulating how it would have worked in the past and then going on to implement. Without repeating all the challenges that appeared on the screen and that will be available to whoever would like to get a copy of the PowerPoint, awaiting dissemination of the full text, I select one challenge: evaluate risk tolerances at the national level, which I hope very much may be taken up. This is one aspect of what is the main theoretical message of my lectures. We should learn to reason naturally, automatically, spontaneously in the framework of economies operating under uncertainty with incomplete markets and incomplete preferences, and even if we have only incomplete results today. Thank you for your attention.